Hello, I'm Marlene Saeed. This is Counting the Cost on Al Jazeera, your weekly look at the world of business and economics. This week, the American economy is on a roll. Why has it pulled so far ahead of the rest of the world? And is it a win for President Biden? Also this week, EU farmers are furious. Governments across the bloc have raced to address their grievances and the European Commission has given ground. But is it enough? And barred from exporting big money earners like coal, North Korea looks to false eyelashes to shore up its economy. Geopolitical tensions, the pandemic's lingering aftershocks, high inflation and steep borrowing costs. Countries across the globe have faced multiple crises for months now. And just last year, the world's biggest economy, the US, among others, was at risk of recession. Today, though, its GDP is growing faster than expected. Stocks are soaring and the job market is hot. The American economy is not just strong, it's also powered ahead of the European Union, the UK, Japan and other advanced economies. But why is the US so resilient? Fintan Monahan has more.
Many had predicted a recession, but the latest jobs data suggests the US economy may have weathered the storm. US President Joe Biden is hailing the turnaround as a sign his policies are working.
In recent weeks, we're starting to see real evidence that American consumers are facing real confidence in their economy we're building.
The US economy added 353,000 jobs in January, nearly double what some analysts expected. The IMF is predicting that the US economy will grow 2.1% this year. That's far more than comparable developed economies in Europe or Japan. In another positive sign, the Federal Reserve says interest rates may come down within the next 12 months, a signal that inflation is coming under control.
We believe that our policy rate is likely at its peak for this tightening cycle, and that, if the economy evolves broadly as expected, it will likely be appropriate to begin dialing back policy restraint at some point this year.
The cause of the American success story is less clear. Some point to its young population, making for a more flexible and productive workforce.
The single biggest reason why the economy is growing, because you are the best workers in the world. That's not hyperbole. No, you really are. You really are. And when labor does well, everybody does better.
But there are other factors. The war in Ukraine disrupted supply chains and caused major economic shocks. But this hit Europe and other regions much harder than the US. The American economy has also been propped up by high government spending. Stimulus packages pumped money into the economy during the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's continued through Biden's infrastructure initiatives. Some economists warn that these policies are piling up debt, both for the government and consumers.
I think we need to remember that there still is a decent amount of actual fiscal stimulus happening out of DC. While there is a monetary policy that's contracting credit, that fiscal policy still is helping prop up the U.S. consumer. And then unfortunately, a big part of it is also consumer debt. If you look at credit card uses, it is well up on a year-over-year average.
The challenge now facing U.S. policymakers is making the current economy sustainable and staying on course to avoid a recession. Fintan Monahan, Al Jazeera for Counting the Cost.
OK, joining us from St. Gallen in Switzerland is Simon Evenet. He's an economics professor at the University of St. Gallen. Thank you for joining the programme. Simon, why do you think the US economy is powering ahead of the rest of the world?
Well, two things have fallen into place. The first was the relief in global supply chain pressures in the United States was, I think, a factor which has enabled supply to expand. But supply doesn't expand unless there is additional demand. As you have just heard, there was lingering fiscal stimulus. That's one factor. 2023 saw American consumers spend $500 billion more than they did the previous year. So that's a big boost. On top of that, you had $100 billion of extra manufacturing investment and then a $100 billion improvement in the net export balance. So you add those things together, you get a very healthy economy, and that's exactly what the Americans have been enjoying.
What about when you compare the industrial composition of the two countries? The US, for example, is very focused on technology. It's seen to be ahead when it comes to the race on artificial intelligence. To what extent has that helped the US?
So the amazing developments in IT have been very, especially artificial intelligence, have been particularly important, I think, for pushing up the stock market valuations of a relatively small number of firms. I don't think that has yet translated into a major broad-based macroeconomic improvement, which would arise from productivity gains. So I think a lot of the headline stuff you've seen in the financial markets associated with AI is laying the groundwork for future productivity increases. Now, those productivity increases don't necessarily have to be confined to the United States. Europeans, Japanese, Chinese people can use AI tools as well. The key question will be how quickly those tools diffuse into productivity gains, and which countries steal the march on that particular improvement.
When you look at all the headline numbers that we're discussing here, consumer spending is up, the job numbers are up, the employment market is hot. Yet when it comes down to how people are actually feeling in the United States, they are still very conservative about the future.
That's right. And that's something of a paradox, is that all the numbers that you've described are indeed moving in the right direction, except the classic consumer sentiment measure from the University of Michigan, which is about 20 points below where it should be at a similar point in this cycle. And that is, of course, the thing that's going to weigh on the election outcome. There is, if you dig into that consumer sentiment index, a big divergence between Democratic voters who see things going pretty well and Republican voters who are only just now improving their consumer sentiment numbers, but nowhere near to the level of Democrats. And so you have this perception and reality mismatch. The interesting question will be whether that translates into a very different voting patterns. And if it does, then of course it's going to weigh on the chances of President Biden's re-election.
Why are consumers spending so much if they don't actually feel rich?
It's a great question. And I think part of the answer to that question is, yes, nominal wages have started to catch up with the inflation which was experienced in prior years. And secondly, Americans do have quite a lot of money still from the stimulus checks that they received from the federal government, which they've been running down. Now that money is almost gone, but in 2023, a lot of that money was being spent. And as one of your commentators said earlier, people are borrowing more on their credit cards as well. So put that all together and you do get quite a hefty consumption expenditure increase, which is what we saw last year.
What do you see policy-wise going forward, given we're seeing these sort of boosted numbers in the job market? Will we see a rate cut or won't we?
I think if we see it, it'll be towards the end of Q2, but not before. And then once we get it into the pre-election era, the Fed will be very reluctant to be seen to be cutting interest rates or raising them for that matter, because it will be seen to be picking sides. So I suspect if anything happens, it'll largely happen before the end of the second quarter. And even then it'll be fairly tepid. I think the main reason for this is that the Fed has a very low cost in waiting. There's lots of uncertainty in the world economy when you look at the different flashpoints which are out there. Growth is, as you said earlier, still going quite strong. So there is a concern that inflation might not attenuate as quickly. So all of this points to a cautious Fed not wanting to rock the boat during 2024.
And if we are comparing Europe to the US, what has been the biggest difference, do you think? Is it inflation and how it's been tackled? Why have the Europeans lagged behind?
So Europe has lagged behind for at least two reasons. One, they haven't had the same consumption boost that we saw in the United States. And that's largely because Europeans save a lot more. In fact, multiples as percentages of income than Americans. And so Europeans have not run down their savings. And on top of this, we've had a huge energy price shock, which has really knocked a lot of European manufacturing sideways. If you look at the numbers for German industrial production, which were pretty sick before the invasion of Ukraine, they've now really gone into negative territory. And Germany is the sort of heartbeat is the heart of the European manufacturing economy. So the combination of cautious consumers and manufacturing being knocked sideways by high energy prices goes a long way to explain why Europe is languishing.
Simon, really good to get your thoughts. Simon Evanet, economics professor at the University of St. Gallen. Thank you.
Thank you.
Farmers across Europe say they can no longer make a living. They blame rising costs, cheap imports, green policies and heavy regulation. They've left the fields and taken their grievances to the streets. Under intense pressure, the European Commission has buckled and eased some of those environmental plans. National governments have also made concessions, but many farmers say more needs to be done. Katia Lopez-Horayan has more.
Across Europe, farmers have staged widespread protests, blocking roads with tractors and disrupting traffic near government buildings. From France to Germany, Belgium and Italy, they say EU regulations are making it impossible to get by.
We're demonstrating against Europe, against the common agricultural policy, the bureaucracy, and the countries that are placing products inside the country without health controls. We just can't compete with them.
Agricultural workers are angry about low wages, heavy regulations, and the influx of cheap imports. Lower prices on foreign goods, they say, is pushing them out of business.
We're protesting because we have very high agricultural standards. We must follow a long list of requirements, and we demand that imported goods also meet these same standards.
Imports from Ukraine is another issue. Following Russia's invasion, the EU issued a tariff-free entry of Ukrainian farm products as a way to support Kyiv. Farmers say cheaper imports are driving prices and their income down. Agriculture accounted for nearly 1.5% of the EU's GDP in 2022. Analysts say the figure may seem small, but it reflects the livelihood of millions of farmers throughout the continent. Now, the EU is scrambling to address concerns ahead of the European Parliament elections this year.
The Commission proposed SURE, which is the worthy aim to reduce the risks of chemical plant protection products. But the SURE proposal has become a symbol of polarization. It has been rejected by the European Parliament, so we have to do something. And that is why I will propose to the College to withdraw this proposal.
Under pressure, some countries like Greece and France have announced concessions, like protections against unfair competition and a freeze on diesel tax. But some say it's not enough.
There is one Europe, and in Europe, we should all have the same restrictions, the same norms, and no unfair competition.
Farmers are calling for more concessions to manage the high cost of living. Failure to do so, they say, could lead to a loss of jobs and of billions of dollars in the agriculture industry. Katia Lopez-Horayan, Al Jazeera, for Counting the Cost.
Okay, joining us now from Wageningen in the Netherlands is Jerome Cees. He's Associate Professor of Food and Agricultural Policy at Wageningen University. Thank you so much for your time, sir. So are farmers right about all their grievances? Is the European farming industry in crisis?
Well, I think they're right in the sense that they face a lot of uncertainty. So we see that farmers have been pushed to compete on the world market, that they have to produce against the lowest cost price. But at the same time, we also know that the agricultural sector and the food system in a broader sense are responsible for about a third of European greenhouse gas emissions. Farming is the biggest driver of biodiversity loss. So they also face a lot of, an increase of environmental regulation. And to many farmers, that's just makes that they face a lot of uncertainty about the future of their businesses.
Farming makes up such a tiny part of the European GDP, 1.4%, I believe. So are you surprised that we've seen such concessions from governments?
Well, even though farming itself is makes up a relatively small percentage of the economy, you could say the broader agri-food sector, so the whole industry around it is much larger. And traditionally, the agricultural sector has always had much political influence, both in Brussels and in the national capitals. And we see that that influence is now also being used to try to water down some of the environmental legislative proposals that have been made by Brussels.
Right, as you say, we've just seen the plans being scrapped for this anti-pesticide proposal. What does that tell us about the bloc's ambitions when it comes to green policies?
Well, personally, I'm quite worried by how quickly the Commission is withdrawing some of these legislative proposals that they've been negotiating about for years now. The European Union has committed to international agreements on biodiversity, on climate change. It's not on track to meet those commitments, and the fact that it has now scaled back some of its legislative proposals on pesticide use, on climate change, climate policy, and we see that the agricultural sector has largely been exempted from, for example, the EU's climate policies. I think that's pretty worrying, and it will also, in a longer term, make that farmers will continue to face this uncertainty.
Inflation across Europe has been a big issue, and governments have been trying to bring down the price of food, but that's coming at the cost of farmers. How difficult is it for policymakers to get that balance right between, making everyone happy, essentially?
Yeah, it is a challenge, definitely. But we see that politicians now seem to suggest that inflation is a result of sustainability measures. And I think there's little evidence for that claim. So we see that inflation at this moment is already being driven partly by the effect of climate change, but also because the food industry has increased its prices beyond inflation over the last years. So we see that farmers in general have relatively little bargaining power in relation to the food industry and retailers, and I think that is one of the main reasons why they face these insecurities.
The other issue, of course, is trade deals that Europe is making with other partners around the world who are not necessarily facing the same sort of environmental costs as the ones in Europe. Again, another tricky balancing act, and you can't really blame farmers for being upset about that.
Yeah, you hear many farmer groups complaining that while the EU is raising its standards for its own farmers, and at the same time it's negotiating trade agreements, for example, with Mercosur, a group of Latin American countries, they do not necessarily comply with the same environmental standards. And that's also why the French President Macron, who has faced many of these farmer protests, is now putting a brake on the Mercosur trade negotiation. So you see that, there is that the farming controversy spills over into trade policy, definitely, yeah.
You touched on this already. I mean, agriculture accounting for, I believe, 30% of global greenhouse gas emissions. I mean, that's pretty huge. It is, it's pretty necessary that farming practices are going to have to change if we are to meet those targets. So how do we go forward from this point?
Yeah, I fully agree. The International Panel on Climate Change is quite clear that we really need to radically change our food production, but also consumption practices if we are to meet these climate targets. So I think what is needed is really that governments provide legal certainty to farmers, that they come up with long-term goals of the greenhouse gas emissions that the agricultural sector needs to comply with, and it then uses public money, because a third of the European budget is spent on agriculture, but it currently largely goes to the status quo. So many scientists propose that the EU uses that money to help farmers make that transition rather than just subsidizing them for having land as is currently being done. So the EU could help farmers to transition their businesses and to provide public goods to society.
OK, really good to get your perspective. Jerome Cees, Associate Professor of Food and Agricultural Policy at Wageningen University.
Thank you.
Now, North Korea is known for the manufacturing of missiles. The sector is one of the nation's largest employers and contributes significantly to its economy. But Pyongyang is turning to a less destructive product to raise hard currency and skirt sanctions imposed on its nuclear program. Millions of dollars in sales of false eyelashes have helped revive the nation's exports last year. They are marketed around the world as made in China. But Chinese firms actually import the semi-finished product from North Korea. And once complete, they are exported to the West, Japan and South Korea. Beauty products like false eyelashes aren't subjected to international sanctions, but they may violate bans imposed by the United States. According to Chinese customs data, North Korea exported around 1,680 tons of false eyelashes, beards and wigs to China in 2023. Now, those exports were worth around $167 million. Wigs and eyelashes make up almost 60% of all declared North Korean exports to China. Joining us now from Shizuoka in Japan is Sojiro Takashita. He's Professor of School of Management at the University of Shizuoka. Many thanks for joining the programme. So, North Korea, of course, to most people is known for its nuclear weapons, but it turns out its biggest exports are a lot more innocuous in the form of eyelashes and wigs. I mean, it's an extraordinary amount of exports of these that they are sending to China.
Absolutely. Because of the strong sanction, they're utilizing this methodology as a loophole. And as you just mentioned, it is a large sum. And the fact that they're utilizing China means that they are trying to get away with various issues, including, the corporate CSR, corporate social responsibility. Many of the Western nations, including Japan, shouldn't be able to use these products because it violates, human rights. Obviously, these North Korean workers are under forced labor. Some suggest that, 90% of the income is taken to Kim Jong-il. So basically, they are utilizing this and utilizing their ties with China to basically ward off the sanctions that are being imposed on them.
And Sojiro, just to be clear, a lot of the jump in demand that we've seen, that's come only since the pandemic. Why is that?
Well, there has been a halt of trade between China and North Korea because of the pandemic, as you just pointed out, but that's been lifted. And then there's been a boost of increase that has taken place. And obviously, this eyelash that's made in North Korea is a lot cheaper and also very high quality, even from the Chinese point of view, who are used to low pricing. So obviously, there is a very strong demand by the Chinese in these products.
There are two types of sanctions at stake here, aren't there? They're the sanctions from the United Nations, and then there are separate sanctions that are coming from the US against North Korean products. Which has become an issue?
Well, actually, both. It should be, the former. The latter, we're seeing, the war of hegemony between the United States and China, and obviously China is utilizing North Korea as a reconnaissance dog. But, the bigger picture is, of course, the universal sanction that should come through, especially, on issues like human rights and many of the other issues that North Koreans are violating. But at this point, because it is such a closed border country that it has virtually all the ties of trade with China, it's very difficult to pass that sanction to North Korea.
So how lucrative is this trade to North Korea? I mean, $167 million worth of exports doesn't, it sounds like a lot, but it's not actually that much, is it?
Well, from our perspective, from the free world perspective, it is very small. But from a North Korean point of view, as you pointed out, it consists over 60% of their total export. That is, of course, the official, disclosed number. And we all know that, they do have a lot of arms that is basically illegally, exported to many other countries. So I think we should see this number with, more than just a grain of salt.
Right. And you mentioned forced labor. I mean, do we know if there are any benefits on the North Korean people at all from this income?
Some estimate that they probably get something like 10%, but obviously it's better than nothing. It is a country that has basically been starving. So, and at the same time, there is no option for, the North Korean workers to go otherwise. So, I think they just don't have any other way. That is why it is labeled as a forced labor, I think.
OK, Sojiro, really good to talk to you. Sojiro Takashita, Professor of the School of Management at the University of Shizuoka. And that is our show for this week. Get in touch with us on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Marlene Saeed. Do use the hashtag AJCTC when you do, or you can drop us an email. countingthecost@aljazeera.net is our address. And there's more for you online at aljazeera.com/CTC, which will take you straight to our page, which has individual reports, links, and entire episodes for you to catch up on. That is it for this edition of Counting the Cost. I'm Marlene Saeed from the whole team. Thanks for joining us. The news on Al Jazeera coming up next.